Well, the media continue to campaign for the liberalisation of drug laws, and their latest attempt is via the state radio broadcaster Radio NZ and a documentary by Guyon Espiner called Wasted, which also happens to be broadcast on our state TV broadcaster TVNZ. And as usual, it was a one-sided narrative being pushed. Let's check it out. So right from the start of the documentary, it was pretty clear what the narrative was going to be. The war on drugs has failed. Well, what war? Now, in 1971, President Richard Nixon declared to the Washington press corps that America had a new enemy, narcotics. He said, America's public enemy number one is drug abuse. And to fight it, it was necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. Now, you'll note he never says war on drugs, but it fits the media narrative.
In 1971, America declared war.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Richard Nixon launched the war on drugs.
In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
New Zealand joined the war on drugs a few years later.
Yeah, even Time magazine admits, quote, within days, US newspapers took up the metaphor. The US was now engaged in a war on drugs. So that was the narrative that they pushed. It wasn't actually said. Now, this was a 44-minute documentary. And within 38 seconds, there's the Pro-Drug Drug Foundation spokesperson, ironically a registered charity that does lots and lots of political lobbying, but they're trying to suggest that Nixon was the Prime Minister of New Zealand because apparently we have Nixon's legislation.
I think New Zealanders might be a little bit disturbed to think we have Richard Nixon's legislation in place to govern our drug policy today in 2022.
Well, that's interesting. Did you know that Richard Nixon wrote New Zealand's legislation? I don't think even the Kiwi politicians knew that. So it was off to a bad start because the problem of drugs was identified and legislated in 1975. Apparently that's a bad thing. By the way, don't tell Guyon Espiner that the Crimes Act dates back to 1961. But apparently the law was based on wrong stuff or not guided by the facts. And that's a chance to bring in our second pro-advocate, who was also part of the Vote Yes campaign for legalising cannabis in the referendum, an ex-drug squad member who has studied criminology and who says we want to make drugs illegal just because of history and prejudice.
It's out that most of what we were told about drugs 50 years ago was wrong, or at least not guided by the facts.
We've legislated certain types of drugs in certain ways because of history and prejudice, not because of science and evidence.
Yeah, apparently. But look, I'll come back to that and let you know what another police drug squad member says, a drug squad member that Guyon didn't seem to want to interview. So next up is a policeman from the National Drug Intelligence Bureau, who we later find out is all good with drug testing, because apparently we'll see less harm if people know that the drug they're taking is the drug they want to take. Go figure. But then there's this bizarre claim that eating cannabis, edibles, is better than smoking it. Do they not understand THC levels and what can be achieved in oils and edibles, dabbing and concentrates, etc.?
With cannabis, if you try to spare your lungs by eating it rather than smoking it, it's actually judged a more dangerous drug.
Cannabis is class C, which kind of makes sense, but if cannabis is formed into an oil or made into some sort of biscuit or edible, it becomes class B.
Who's setting these rules? Who decides?
1975 decides. I mean, it's really bizarre.
But
oh yes, it's bizarre that we're going back to 1975. Drugs have changed. The problem is that they've got stronger, especially cannabis and high THC and the concentrates. That's what people are most nervous about. It's not your Woodstock weed or your parents' pot, as I used to say. Now, one of the amusing things to watch is pro-drug advocates swing from country to state, trying to find a great example of liberalising drug laws. It was Colorado, then it was Canada, Uruguay, then the Netherlands, Portugal. But each time, when we examine the facts, there were major problems. Vancouver was one we recently highlighted, and the problems there. So now the advocates are all talking about a state in Australia, the ACT.
Increasingly, the international community, including parts of Australia, are realising this is not a war they can win.
I think we can all look at the evidence and see the war on drugs in the way that it has been fought and expressed has not been successful. Making drug use a criminal offence and making the possession of small amounts of drugs a criminal offence doesn't stop people using drugs and doesn't stop people possessing those small amounts of drugs for personal use.
Yes, but what they don't tell you, and Guyon certainly doesn't, is that the ACT decriminalised cannabis only 2 years ago. And they have just decriminalised the possession of illicit drugs, including heroin, cocaine, MDMA, and meth. And that's despite the concerns of senior police. But apparently it's working perfectly, with little evidence to corroborate the claim. Now, the program then tries to suggest that police in general agree with the narrative being pushed in this documentary.
But there are pockets of New Zealand where the police are conceding that the war on drugs approach is not working.
What we know is that we're not going to arrest our way out of this.
But see, in my view, Guyon's narration is putting words in the mouth of what the police are saying. They're actually agreeing with us that to really bring change, drug users need to be put into addiction treatment and support services. We agree with that. But the coercion of the law enables that to happen. Otherwise, you get this, where only a handful of drug users a month are engaging with a substance abuse helpline after being given the health referral. And even the health minister says it's abysmally low. It was a 1.7% engagement rate. So as you can see, we need the coercion of the law to bring about the treatment that is needed. Many drug users don't want treatment. Now, Guyon also doesn't mention what else our detective sergeant that he's just interviewed has said, the one he just interviewed. But this is from June just gone, and let me show you what's said. The ongoing supply of any illicit drugs in our communities results in huge social harm, negative health implications, and financial harm, particularly to drug users and their families, Detective Sergeant Shane Pulmer said, the man just interviewed. Police will continue to actively target those with links to organised crime and those involved in the sale and supply of methamphetamine in our community. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? It sort of goes against the narrative. But it was back to our ex-police drug squad member who has now studied criminology at university, and apparently the lights have come on.
At the time, McKinnell felt he was making a difference. But then the drug squad detective began studying for a master's degree in criminology. And the more he learned, the more he began to doubt himself.
To begin with, it was quite confronting. So you start to read evidence that drug enforcement is ineffectual, makes no difference, and so that's difficult to deal with. And in the beginning, I didn't accept it. But as you read more and you begin to understand how the drug markets work and how the black market works, the prevalence of drug use and supply in wider society has persisted over decades. It forces you to think about whether the policies that we have, the enforcement that we have, is working at all.
And is it?
I believe that the war on drugs has been a complete and utter failure. That is not to say that I think a widespread drug use is a good thing, but criminalising communities, generally communities that are in poverty, has failed us. I think there are a whole lot of harms that come with making criminals of people that use and socially deal drugs.
Interesting. So dealers as well. That's very interesting. Those poor, stigmatized dealers of drugs. Ex-prisoner worker and psychiatrist, social commentator Theodore Dalrymple from the UK is blunt when he says this: "The war on drugs is lost is an unimaginative and fundamentally stupid metaphor, which exerts a baleful effect on proper thought. If the war against drugs is lost, then so are the wars against theft, speeding, incest, fraud, rape, murder, arson, and illegal parking. Few, if any, such wars are winnable." And then our documentary is off to promote drug testing.
This is strictly about health and science. The information cannot be used in criminal evidence.
So people can feel very confident that when they come here to get their drugs checked, it's just good quality information that's coming back to them and no fear of prosecution.
This is the harm reduction approach at work. The idea that some people are always going to take drugs, so they might as well take them safely.
Most of the
Yep. Well, drug testing may tell you if a drug has additional material in it which is harmful, but here's the problem. It doesn't guarantee that the drug being taken will not cause any physical or mental harm or death to the individual consumer. It also can't account for an individual's physiological response to each drug. Drug testing can't test for the use of other drugs that the person may take. Drug testing cannot test for dosage. In other words, how many pills the person consumes. They may test one pill, but that person might have another 9 in their pocket to consume. And drug testing is incapable of preventing home deaths if the drug is consumed later at home. You know, there have been many recent examples where drugs have caused significant harm, and these drugs would have been given the green light by drug testing anyway. The real problem with drug testing is that it's seen by many younger people especially as basically a green light, a clear endorsement of drug use. It sends a message that illicit drugs are acceptable and can be safe and will worsen harmful drug use, so that more lives will be put at risk with the belief that the drug they are taking is somehow safe. Drug testing sounds well-intentioned, but behind the smokescreen is simply another ill-informed decision to consume illicit drugs. Now, in this 44-minute documentary, there is a contrary view, a balanced view, but it's very short, and it's given in a disparaging way and misrepresents what these advocates are saying, but apparently it's hardline. Oh, and then there's a little tour around the world in this clip to try and find places that have got it right, except they haven't. It's rather amusing. But anyway, let's watch these hardliners.
And this hardline approach has long had political support.
I believe any measures are justified, and if they don't work, then we'll bring in harder penalties and other methods.
This is not your Woodstock weed or your parents' pot.
1,000 years will pass before I ever vote yes.
I will be voting against the legalisation of cannabis.
When we talk about the failure of the war on drugs, I just don't accept that. It's not a war that's been lost, it's an ongoing war. It doesn't mean we throw up our hands and say it's too difficult and we're just going to turn this into a health issue now.
New Zealand came close to major drug reform in 2020, but the referendum to legalise cannabis narrowly failed.
What a
Portugal
shame.
decriminalised all drugs more than 20 years ago now, and the model has spread to other countries, including Canada and parts of America and Australia.
Not only
Oh, there we go. We start around the world. That was a terrible bunch of people, wasn't it? First time I've been lumped in with Robert Muldoon, actually. And so the documentary continues. Now, look, on the positive side, it shows that drug users benefit from treatment and rehabilitation. It just fails to understand the purpose and role of the law. But what the documentary also highlights, but doesn't quite connect the dots on, is that available addiction treatment services and family support are sadly lacking, just like our mental health service at the moment. And that's where the real focus should be. You know, they say that the war on drugs has failed. They keep using this term, but perhaps you should add ram raiders and fleeing, speeding drivers to that list. Has the war on them failed? Didn't the government just announce a new war on those two issues? What about the stigma towards those poor ram raiders and fleeing drivers? Now, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime said this: cannabis prevention efforts are crucial because cannabis is often the first illegal drug used by youth. Preventing substance use before it begins not only makes common sense, it is also cost effective. For every dollar invested in prevention, a savings of up to 10 million in treatment can be realised. And they went on to recommend that cannabis possession should remain a punishable offence while its use should be prevented and its continued use treated. And that's our argument. We should continue fighting drugs and the devastation its use causes on both the users, their families, and society in general. Just back to another police drug squad member that this documentary weren't keen on interviewing. And there was an article, "I used to be on the police drug squad. Here's why I'm voting against legalising cannabis." And this is what they said in that article. "I agree that for end users of drugs where the use of that drug begins to affect a person's health or mental well-being, medical or other intervention is very important, rather than putting the person before the courts. But the reality of policing the drug world is that police do not actively target end users of drugs. They target the manufacturers and dealers, those who are the main contributors to the harm." He continues, "As far as cannabis is concerned, again, police do not target end users, and despite the social media commentary, I do not know of any end users of cannabis who have ever been in prison for simply smoking a joint. That simply does not happen. Anyone in prison for possession of cannabis or utensils will be there for other more serious charges as well, involving offences such as dealing, manufacture, possession of firearms, etc. The commentary that people end up in prison for smoking cannabis is misleading. They do not." Now, Guyon didn't seem to want to talk to this ex-cop. In fact, nobody from our side of the debate was interviewed. Funny that. Remember that the law also was changed recently to allow police to use discretion to push low-level drug users to treatment. It was effectively decriminalisation, but not just cannabis, it was all drugs. Now, just one more clip that I found interesting. An ex-user turned their life around. How did they do it? Well, it was because of the law that they ended up in front of a drug court, which mandated treatment. If it wasn't illegal, she would never have been apprehended. She would never have ended up in the drug court. She would never have been coerced to get the treatment and be set free from the drug addiction.
But Jo, with the 12 pages of convictions, she's turned her life around too. For her, the turning point was a specialist drug court rather than yet another drug conviction. In the drug courts, the judge oversees a team which works on a treatment and rehab plan for the offender. Now Jo is helping people deal with drug issues and homelessness in a program run from the Merge Cafe in central Auckland.
Yeah, isn't that awesome? That coercion to get the treatment they need. Now, look, just finally, here's a really ironic part. On the day after this documentary was released, this was posted on the Facebook page of North Shore, Rodney and West Auckland Police. "Police have seized millions of dollars worth of cannabis plants, taking them out of the hands of gangs and organised crime, and restrained a significant haul of assets as part of two major investigations by police's money laundering team and the Auckland-based Asset Recovery Unit. This week sees the termination of Operation Peruvian, an investigation into a large-scale cannabis cultivation in Northland, where 6,500 cannabis plants worth an estimated street value of more than 10 million have been seized and destroyed." But here's the key bit in the post on the Facebook page. "The cultivation, manufacture, supply and distribution of controlled drugs continues to be a major driver in all serious crimes within our communities. We will continue to use all available resources to strip assets and wealth from those who have accumulated it through the sale of these illicit substances." Exactly right. And well done, and thank you to the New Zealand Police. Look, it's not about a war. We don't need an army, machine guns, informants, patrols. We need a stay drug-free message. It's about enforcing drug laws to protect families, protect communities, protect health. We should continue fighting drugs and the devastation its use causes on both the users, their families, and society in general. I've watched the documentary. Now you don't need to. You can thank me later.